AI podcast.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're exploring something really fundamental, this ancient human impulse, the desire to inhale substances. From way back, ceremonial puffs, all the way to today's sort of elaborate vapor clouds, it's definitely evolved. But is it really better or just, well, different?
Yeah, our focus is what one source we looked at called the epochal battle of lungs. So traditional cigarettes, the ones you burn, versus those sleek USB charging, often flavored e-cigarettes or vapes. And our mission today, we want to cut through all the smoke and the vapor too, frankly. We're going to examine the science, the research with real rigor. We're asking that big question. Is one really better than the other? Or is it just, moving furniture around on the Titanic of respiratory health? We want to give you the solid info, the nuggets of knowledge so you can be genuinely well informed. And to do that, we've dived deep into some compelling research.
There's this really thought-provoking inquiry from MIT, which interestingly is currently ranked the world's top university by QS World University Rankings for 2025. Plus, we've pulled in insights from other peer-reviewed studies and analyses. Okay, so let's unpack this. For, generations, the cigarette was king, wasn't it? A smoky monarch, you saw it everywhere. Coffee breaks, rebellious teens, movie scenes.
Absolutely ubiquitous.
But its whole reign was built on a pretty grim truth. It was actively, demonstrably trying to kill you. I mean, our sources, including the CDC for 2025, they point out cigarettes have something like 7,000 chemical compounds.
Right, and 69 of those are known carcinogens. Just think about that number.
Yeah. They're called the undisputed heavyweights of self-inflicted respiratory distress. No ambiguity there.
Not at all.
Then, boom, e-cigarettes arrive, the disruptive innovator, right? The sort of tech bro of tobacco consumption.
Yeah.
And the promise was safer nicotine delivery. Plus, all those flavors from, well, some pretty wild names like unicorn puke to grandma's secret custard.
The marketing was definitely different.
Very different. They're sleek. Often you can't smell much, unlike cigarettes, and no smelly fingers. But the question our sources keep asking is, okay, is this modern marvel really the hero? Or just a wolf in sheep's clothing? Maybe a mango-scented one?
That's the core of it, isn't it? Let's actually look at what you're inhaling. With traditional cigarettes, the science is just overwhelming. Decades of data. Johns Hopkins Medicine highlights this for 2025. Link smoking to this horrible list. Lung cancer, heart disease, COPD, strokes, shorter lifespan.
The usual suspects, unfortunately.
Exactly. The act of burning tobacco itself creates this chemical soup that just assaults your lungs and your whole cardiovascular system. It's brutal.
Okay, so that's the baseline. How do vapes differ in what they deliver?
Right, so vapes work differently. They heat a liquid, the e-liquid, which is usually nicotine, flavorings, propylene glycol, and vegetable glycerin to create an aerosol, not smoke.
Aerosol, not smoke. Key difference.
A very key difference. And proponents correctly argue that because there's no combustion, you don't get the tar and thousands of those other harmful chemicals found in cigarette smoke.
Okay, so that sounds much better on the surface.
It does. However, and this is a really critical point, our sources stress. Less harmful does not mean harmless. It's a crucial distinction.
Right. Less bad isn't the same as good.
Precisely. E-cigarette aerosol generally has fewer harmful chemicals, yes. But the CDC points out it still contains potentially dangerous stuff. Studies have found things like heavy metals, lead, nickel, chromium.
Heavy metals? Wow.
Yeah, and volatile organic compounds, VOCs, plus ultrafine particles that can go deep into your lungs. And another thing, some flavorings, look at the ones that are perfectly safe to eat.
Yeah.
Well, they can become toxic when you heat them up and inhale them. Diacetyl is the classic example, linked to popcorn lung, according to Johns Hopkins.
Popcorn lung, right, I've heard of that.
So vaping isn't risk-free. You could, as one source put it, be doing an internal chemistry experiment with unpredictable results, which really makes you wonder about the long-term picture, doesn't it?
That phrase, internal chemistry experiment, is chilling, because the one thing linking both the constant is nicotine, this incredibly addictive substance. It's the puppet master here.
Absolutely. It drives the behavior for both.
For cigarettes, we know the path well. Nicotine hits the brain fast, dopamine floods out, reinforces smoking. Simple, effective action.
Run the path, yes.
But vapes seem to have, well, maybe up the ante. Many e-liquids, especially those little pod systems everyone sees, have really high nicotine concentrations, often using something called nicotine salts.
That's right. UCSF and the CDC have flagged this. Nicotine salts make the vapor smoother, less harsh to inhale.
Meaning you can take in much higher doses without that throat hit.
Exactly. Potentially leading to faster, maybe even more intense addiction. This is a huge concern, especially for adolescents, because their brains are still developing and more vulnerable.
It feels like giving a learner driver a Formula One engine.
That's a good analogy. And research backs this up. While some vape users think it's less addictive, a lot actually report feeling very addicted, particularly those using high nicotine liquids or vaping right after waking up, a classic sign of dependence, according to the National Health Service.
So it begs the question, if vaping was supposed to help people get off nicotine, are we just creating a new wave of addiction? Maybe even a stronger one for some.
Well, the sources suggest it's complicated, but probably yes. For many people, it's a serious unintended consequence.
Which leads us straight into this whole harm reduction debate.
Precisely. It's central and, frankly, very controversial. The core argument for harm reduction goes like this. For adults already smoking, who can't or won't quit nicotine completely, switching entirely to vaping significantly cuts their exposure to the worst stuff in tobacco smoke.
Okay, that makes logical sense. Less exposure to the known killers.
And that's where the famous Public Health England statement from 2015 comes in, that e-cigarettes are around 95% less harmful than smoking.
95%, that's a huge number.
It is. And there's evidence to back up the less harm idea. Studies looking at biomarkers, levels of toxins in the body, show vapors generally have much lower levels of carcinogens and other toxicants compared to smokers. The Royal College of Physicians noted this in 2021.
So, purely from a chemical exposure view, vaping seems like the lesser of two evils compared to smoking combustibles.
It's hard to argue against that specific point. Choosing vaping over smoking is often framed like choosing between, say, getting hit by a small car versus a freight train. Neither is good, but one gives you better odds.
Okay, but it sounds like there are some big buts coming. What are the catches, the public health worries?
Oh, absolutely. It's far from straightforward. A major issue is dual use. Lots of smokers don't actually switch completely. They smoke and vape.
So they're getting toxins from both sources.
Exactly, which, according to the CDC, pretty much negates the harm reduction benefit. And worse, some research from PMC in 2020 suggests dual users might even face higher risks for things like heart attacks compared to those who only smoke or only vape.
Wow, so it's not a clean switch for many.
Not at all. Then there's the gateway effect, especially concerning for young people. The data consistently shows teens who vape are significantly more likely to eventually start smoking regular cigarettes.
The CDC points to this too.
Yes. And think about it, the appealing flavors, the social media trends. Vaping can seem like a cool, less risky way into nicotine. A UK study back in 2016 found teens who vaped were almost 12 times more likely to start smoking later.
12 times. That's massive.
It's a huge number.
Yeah.
And finally, the big unknown. Long-term effects. Vaping just hasn't been around long enough. We have decades of data on smoking's toll. For vaping, we have short-term, maybe some medium-term studies emerging, but the real long-term health consequences. Still largely a mystery. A scientific mystery box, as one source called it.
Balancing potential immediate benefits against completely unknown long-term risks, that's a tough equation.
It really is.
And thinking about unknowns,
Right.
what about the people around the vapor? We all know about secondhand smoke dangers. What's the story with secondhand vapor? And how is the general public actually perceiving all this complexity? Because it feels like there's confusion.
There definitely is confusion. Let's start with secondhand vapor. We know secondhand smoke is dangerous, full stop. Secondhand vapor does dissipate faster, and it has fewer toxic chemicals, according to sources like My Health Alberta. And it's a big deb, but it's not harmless.
Still contains nicotine, other stuff.
Yes. Bystanders can still be exposed to nicotine, those ultrafine particles we mentioned, and other chemicals. There's research cited by PMC in 2024 showing kids exposed to secondhand vapor absorb less nicotine than from smoke, sure, but still more than kids with zero exposure.
So maybe not staining the walls, but still not something you necessarily want floating around, especially near kids. Basic consideration applies.
Exactly. Basic decency, as one source put it.
Okay, now the perception part. This sounds fascinatingly messy.
It really is. There's a huge disconnect.
Yeah.
A 2024 study for UCL in the UK found 57%, more than half, of English smokers wrongly believe vaping is just as harmful or even worse than smoking.
Wait, smokers believe that? The very people who could potentially benefit from switching.
Right. And in the U.S., an American Chemical Society report covering 2018-2019 found that number was even higher. Over 82% of smokers held that view.
That seems like a massive public health communication failure. If smokers think vaping is just as bad, why would they switch?
Precisely. It undermines the harm reduction potential completely. But then you have the flip side. Vaping's cool factor, especially among youth. Think Instagram influencers, vapor tricks.
Right, the cloud bros.
Yeah. An ASH survey in the UK in 2022 showed youth vaping prevalence was up to 8.6%, a big jump from 4% the year before. So we need clearer communication to dispel the myths for smokers, but without making vaping seem glamorous or risk-free to kids. It's a tough balancing act.
Definitely a tightrope walk.
Hmm.
Okay, let's get a bit more specific on the health impacts. Cardiovascular and respiratory, the big two for smoking. How does vaping stack up based on what we know now?
Good question. Let's take cardiovascular first. Cigarettes, their rap sheet is horrific, we know that. Heart attacks, strokes, atherosclerosis. The link is undeniable, as researchers like Ambrose and Barua outlined way back in 2004.
Okay, established killer. What about vapes?
Well, they're definitely not getting a clean bill of health. There's a growing body of epidemiological evidence suggesting e-cigarettes are an independent risk factor for increased cardiovascular disease and death.
Independent, meaning even if you don't smoke.
Yes. Research highlighted by the NIH in 2022 showed people who used e-cigarettes were 19% more likely to develop heart failure. And crucially, both vapers and smokers showed immediate negative effects after you used bigger spikes in blood pressure, heart rate, and blood vessel constriction compared to non-users.
So similar immediate impacts on the cardiovascular system.
Similar immediate stress on the system, yes. And chronic vapors. Studies found they had impaired blood vessel function, quite similar to what's seen in smokers. The bottom line seems to be that nicotine itself, whether from smoke or vapor, is a major culprit for the heart, the real heartbreaker, as one source aptly put it.
Okay, nicotine hitting the heart hard either way. What about the lungs? Respiratory issues.
Right, respiratory. Cigarettes cause absolute carnage. COPD, emphysema, bronchitis, lung cancer, well-documented devastation.
No question there.
Vaping. It seems to present a different kind of challenge. Some sources even say it's concerning in entirely new ways. There's emerging data linking vaping to chronic lung disease and asthma. Johns Hopkins research points to associations between dual-use smoking and vaping and cardiovascular disease, too.
So new kinds of lung problems, potentially.
Potentially. A 2022 review in NPJ Primary Care Respiratory Medicine found vaping increases airway resistance. And a 2019 study in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine reported that non-smokers who start vaping face a 62% higher rate of wheezing.
62% higher wheezing, that's significant.
It is. And then, of course, there was the evil EI outbreak in 2019-2020. Nearly 3,000 hospitalizations, 68 deaths, mostly linked to illicit THC vape cartridges containing vitamin E acetate.
Right, that was terrifying.
It was a stark reminder that the safety of vaping really hinges on what's in the cartridge. It showed we don't always know what people are inhaling. We are effectively conducting a real-time epidemiological experiment on millions of people.
A real-time experiment. That phrase really hits home, especially when we think about kids.
Exactly.
Because that youth aspect seems critical. Nowhere is this debate more fraught. You mentioned the ASH data for the UK. What about the US?
The numbers are alarming. The CDC reported that in 2024, e-cigarettes were the most commonly used tobacco product among U.S. middle and high schoolers. We're talking 1.63 million students currently using them.
1.6 million. Wow. So the very product potentially helpful for adult smokers is the main entry point for kids into nicotine addiction.
That's the tragic irony. Yes, vapes might reduce exposure to tar and some chemicals compared to cigarettes, but they can ramp up nicotine dependency. And that trade-off is particularly worrying for developing brains, which are just so much more susceptible to addiction.
Which brings us back to that fundamental debate. Harm reduction versus, well, something else. How do the sources frame this clash?
It's framed as a really difficult ethical and practical dilemma. Proponents of harm reduction look at the, say, 34 million Americans who currently smoke and argue that switching them to vaping could save millions of lives. It's a kind of utilitarian calculus, right?
The greatest good for the greatest number, even if the solution isn't perfect.
Exactly. Vaping isn't safe, but it's safer than smoking. So the argument goes, better should be good enough.
Okay, what's the counter-argument?
Critics push back hard. They say this approach normalizes nicotine use overall, it creates new addicts, especially among youth, and it basically allows tobacco companies to stay in business, just selling a different product. Some compare it to giving an alcoholic lower-proof vodka and calling it treatment.
Strong words.
Very.
Yeah.
And this leads to what our sources suggest might be the most important takeaway. Asking, is vaping better than smoking? Might actually be the wrong question.
The wrong question. How so?
Because it forces a choice between two harmful things. It's like asking if it's better to be stabbed or shot. Well, neither, right? Or the analogy one source used, asking if Russian roulette is safer with 5 bullets or 6. Technically, yes, 5 is safer, but you're missing the obvious point that the ideal number is 0.
0 bullets. 0 nicotine inhalation.
Precisely. So these sources suggest future research should focus on more productive questions, like
Right.
how do we effectively treat nicotine addiction regardless of the source? What social factors drive people, especially kids, to start using these products? How do we balance individual choice with protecting public health? What are the long-term societal costs of having millions dependent on nicotine?
Those seem like much deeper, more useful questions to be asking.
Agreed. They shift the focus from just comparing two bad options to tackling the underlying problem of nicotine dependence itself.
Okay, so after diving this deep, wrestling with all this data, where do we land? Is one actually better?
Well, if we have to answer that specific question based on the evidence, from a purely toxicological view, for an adult smoker who quits cigarettes completely and switches only to vaping, vaping appears likely less harmful.
Likely less harmful.
Okay.
Less catastrophically bad, as you put it earlier.
Yes, that's a fair way to phrase it.
However.
It-
And this
it's-
seems like a huge however.
It is. For non-smokers, and especially for young people, starting to vape is undeniably risky. It introduces nicotine addiction, exposes them to that cocktail of potentially harmful chemicals, even if it's fewer than in smoke, and it clearly acts as a gateway to smoking for some.
So less harmful isn't harmless, and starting is definitely harmful.
Absolutely. The most honest answer really is that neither is good. The only truly safe level of exposure to either cigarette smoke or vape aerosol is 0. Complete cessation from all inhaled nicotine products, that's the gold standard. That's the real win for health.
Right, 0 is the goal.
0 is the goal.
And perhaps that most provocative thought to leave our listeners with comes back to that wrong question idea. Maybe the real question isn't vaping versus smoking. Maybe it's this. Why now, in the 21st century, knowing everything we know about addiction, about health, why do we still accept a reality where millions remain dependent on nicotine delivered through any device?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. Something for you, our listeners, to think about, to chew on. And maybe it inspires you to do your own deep dive